Night after night, bodies started appearing near the banks of Washington State's Green River. Young women and teenage girls, many last seen along the same stretch of Pacific Highway South just outside Seattle, were vanishing and then turning up in shallow graves, clustered dump sites, or face down in the water. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement realized something terrifying. They weren't dealing with isolated murders, but a serial predator who seemed to be hunting with impunity. He stalked the vulnerable, women working in sex trades or living on the margins, people police and the public too often ignored. Witnesses described a nondescript man in a pickup truck. Ordinary, forgettable. For decades, he stayed one step ahead. Today, we're unpacking how Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, became one of America's most prolific murderers, claiming at least 49 lives, likely many more, and how he managed to avoid capture for nearly 20 years while operating right under everyone's nose. This is the story of the Green River Killer, how he selected his victims, why investigators struggled to stop him, and how a seemingly ordinary truck painter from the Seattle suburbs hid a monstrous secret for decades. We'll follow the timeline from the first known body in 1982 through the frantic 1980s manhunt, the frustrating dead ends, and the eventual forensic breakthrough that finally ended his killing career. Along the way, we'll look at systemic failures, how bias against sex workers slowed urgency, how interagency rivalries muddied the investigation, and how early forensic limitations gave him space to operate. If you're interested in deep dive true crime, make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell on so you don't miss episodes like this. And stay with me through to the end, because the most chilling part of this case isn't just what Ridgway did, but how close authorities came to stopping him, only to let him slip away. To understand how Ridgway could operate for so long, we need to start with his early life. Born in 1949, Gary Ridgway grew up in a working-class family in the Seattle area. Accounts from classmates and neighbors paint him as quiet, slow in school, sometimes cruel. One disturbing incident stands out. As a teenager, he reportedly stabbed a 6-year-old boy, leaving him seriously injured, yet faced almost no lasting consequences. At home, his relationship with his domineering mother was tense and sexually charged in ways he later described to psychologists as confusing and humiliating. Ridgway developed a deep resentment toward women, especially those he saw as promiscuous or morally inferior. Outwardly, though, he appeared unremarkable, a man with a steady job, multiple marriages, and a reputation as a hard-working, if somewhat odd, co-worker. That camouflage, blending into the background, would later become one of his most powerful tools in evading capture. Ridgway's choice of victims was strategic. He targeted girls and women who were least likely to trigger intense public outcry: runaways, sex workers, and those struggling with addiction. In the early 1980s, Seattle's Pacific Highway South was lined with motels, truck stops, and strolls where women worked the streets to survive. Ridgway cruised this strip in his pickup, posing as a paying customer. He often showed his son's photograph to gain trust, creating a false sense of safety. Many victims stepped into his truck believing they'd be back on the street within an hour. Instead, he drove them to secluded wooded areas or down to the Green River. Once there, he attacked rapidly, usually strangling them, sometimes using a ligature. By preying on those society routinely overlooked and whose disappearances were often not immediately reported, Ridgway exploited gaps in both community concern and police response. The first body linked to the Green River Killer surfaced on July 15, 1982, when 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield was found in the river, tangled in the pilings of a bridge. Soon, more bodies appeared, some in the water, others dumped in nearby brush or shallow graves. By the end of that summer, at least 5 victims were tied to the same killer, marked by similar methods of strangulation and disposal near the Green River. Panic grew among women working the highway, but the wider public was slower to react. Early on, investigators struggled to even confirm they were dealing with a single offender, lacking today's computerized databases and DNA tools. Different jurisdictions handled different scenes, frequently failing to share information efficiently. Evidence was collected, but not always preserved in ways that would later prove useful. The Green River Task Force formed, yet from the outset they were racing against a killer who seemed to understand their blind spots. The Green River Task Force ballooned into one of the largest serial murder investigations in U.S. history. Detectives pored over missing persons reports, canvassed the highway strolls, and interviewed hundreds of sex workers, pimps, and johns. They compiled index cards, handwritten notes, and crude databases in an era before modern digital case management systems. Thousands of tips flooded in, generating mountains of paper but few solid leads. The killer seemed invisible. No fingerprints that matched anyone in their files, no eyewitness who could definitively identify him. Profilers suggested he might be a local working man, organized yet socially awkward, with deep hatred toward women. But these psychological sketches weren't enough to narrow the field. Meanwhile, media coverage turned the Green River Killer into a grim local legend, further complicating the investigation as false confessors and hoax callers wasted precious time. The task force was under pressure, yet each new body suggested their quarry was still confident and in control. Incredibly, Gary Ridgway came onto detectives' radar early. In 1982 and 1983, he was questioned multiple times because witnesses had seen him with women who later vanished. He admitted frequenting sex workers, claiming he'd done so for years, but denied any violence. At one point, he even passed a polygraph test. Technology investigators then trusted far more than they do today. Officers searched his home and truck, collecting carpet fibers, rope, and other potential evidence. But with limited forensic capabilities, nothing directly tied him to the murders. Ridgway's low-key demeanor worked in his favor. He seemed boring, cooperative, almost painfully ordinary. Detectives, juggling dozens of suspects, gradually pushed him down their priority list. In hindsight, the irony is brutal. The killer sat in interview rooms looking his pursuers in the eye, then walked out free because science, systems, and human judgment weren't yet sharp enough to see who he really was. One of the eeriest twists in the Green River case involves another infamous name, Ted Bundy. By the mid-1980s, Bundy sat on death row in Florida, but he closely followed media coverage of the Seattle killings. When word reached investigators that Bundy wanted to help, some saw an opportunity. Detectives visited him in prison, hoping his predatory insight could illuminate the Green River killer's mind. Bundy suggested that the killer might return to dump sites to revisit bodies, perhaps even to perform necrophilic acts, behavior Bundy himself had engaged in. He advised staking out known disposal areas and watching for repeat visitors. While it's unclear how much concrete progress came directly from Bundy's input, his chillingly accurate psychological read reinforced what investigators already suspected. Their suspect was methodical, local, and deeply sexually motivated. Yet even with this macabre consulting, the task force still lacked the forensic power needed to conclusively link anyone to the crimes. Throughout the 1980s, forensic science was limited. DNA profiling was in its infancy, costly and not widely available. In many Green River cases, physical evidence existed: semen, fibers, hairs, but laboratories couldn't yet extract the tiny genetic signatures that are routine today. Instead, investigators relied on blood typing, hair comparison, and fiber analysis, all far less definitive. Ridgway seemed to understand this, or at least intuitively grasped that police couldn't easily link him to his victims. He sometimes left bodies in water to wash away trace evidence. He moved remains, scattering them across different sites to confuse timelines. He often picked victims whose social circles were small and transient, generating fewer witnesses. Because he maintained steady employment and outward normality, no one close to him suspected the scale of his crimes. The gap between what investigators needed to catch him and what their tools could deliver created a deadly window he ruthlessly exploited. Ridgway's home life helped shield him. He worked as a painter at a truck plant, showing up reliably and earning a reputation as a dependable, frugal employee. He married multiple times, Some wives later described him as controlling, intensely religious in a superficial way, and sexually demanding. He read the Bible, condemned sex workers publicly, yet paid them privately. Neighbors saw a quiet man who mowed his lawn, attended church, and played the role of family man. This dual existence allowed him to present an alibi of normalcy. When questioned, co-workers vouched that he was at work. Partners rarely imagined he might be sneaking out to kill between shifts. His ability to compartmentalize, maintaining an everyday routine while committing horrific acts, confused investigators who still clung to the stereotype that serial killers must appear obviously disturbed or socially deviant. Ridgway's banality was his disguise, and society's assumptions helped him hide in plain sight. As the years dragged on, public interest rose and fell. Bodies continued to surface into the early 1990s, but at a slower pace. Some believe Ridgway temporarily reduced his killing or changed methods to avoid detection. The original task force was eventually downsized. Resources shifted to new priorities as political pressure eased. Files were archived, leads went cold, and crucial details faded from memory. Yet behind the scenes, some detectives refused to let the case die. Evidence boxes were carefully preserved, waiting for a future where technology might catch up. This period of apparent quiet is part of how Ridgway extended his freedom. He outlasted institutional urgency. The longer a case runs without a clear suspect, the more likely budgets, attention, and public anger drift elsewhere. Ridgway didn't need brilliance to evade capture. He needed patience, consistency, and a system prone to moving on before it had finished its work. By the late 1990s, everything changed. DNA analysis had matured into a powerful investigative tool capable of generating profiles from tiny decades-old samples. King County investigators reopened key Green River evidence, carefully stored swabs, clothing, and fibers, and submitted them for modern testing. In 2001, the breakthrough finally came. DNA recovered from several victims matched a man already in Washington State's offender database, Gary Leon Ridgway. He'd been required to give a DNA sample years earlier after a prostitution-related charge. Now, the genetic link that 1980s science couldn't provide snapped into place. Detectives moved quickly, arresting him outside the truck plant where he'd worked for decades. The arrest wasn't dramatic. Co-workers watched in shock as their seemingly ordinary colleague was taken away in handcuffs. After nearly 2 decades of fear and frustration, the Green River Killer had a name and a face, and he was someone investigators had spoken to many times before. Faced with overwhelming DNA evidence, Ridgway eventually struck a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In exchange for life imprisonment, he agreed to confess in detail and help locate additional victims. During interviews, he described killing as his career, admitting he often lost track of how many women he'd murdered. He showed chilling detachment, saying he chose sex workers because he thought no one would miss them, and because they were easier to lure. Officially, he was convicted of 49 murders, but he claimed to have killed more than 70. Many believe the true number may never be known. Ridgway calmly led investigators to previously unknown dump sites, walking through woods where he'd once dragged bodies. His matter-of-fact tone underscored a grim reality. For years, a man capable of staggering brutality had moved through society completely unnoticed, because our systems, biases, and technologies weren't built to confront someone exactly like him. The Green River Killer case leaves several hard lessons. First, vulnerability matters. Ridgway targeted those society already devalued: sex workers, runaways, and marginalized women, counting on slow responses and limited outrage. Second, investigative systems in the 1980s were fragmented. Agencies guarded information, technology was primitive, and record-keeping made it easy for suspects like Ridgway to slip into the background. Third, appearances mislead. He was not a cinematic monster, but a quiet man with a steady job, mowing his lawn beside everyone else. Finally, advances in forensic science, especially DNA, proved decisive. but only because some investigators preserved evidence for a future they couldn't yet see. Today, his case drives ongoing reforms in how police track missing persons, treat sex workers, and share data across jurisdictions. Remembering the victims and understanding the failures that enabled their killer is essential if we want to prevent similar predators from thriving again. If this deep dive into the Green River Killer case gave you new insight into how a seemingly ordinary man became one of America's most prolific murderers, there's a lot more we can explore together. On this channel, we break down complex true crime stories, not just to retell horror, but to understand the systems, biases, and technologies that shape who gets caught and who doesn't. If you haven't already, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you'll know when the next investigation drops. In upcoming episodes, we'll look at other long-running serial cases, forensic breakthroughs, and the changing ethics of true crime storytelling. Let me know in the comments which aspect of the Green River case struck you most: the investigative failures, the forensic turnaround, or Ridgway's double life. And if you want more long-form breakdowns, check the playlist linked on screen now. Thanks for watching and remembering the victims behind the headlines.